Alexandra, do you want to talk about the war, the beginning of the war from the Soviet perspective or from the Russian perspective? You talked about a little bit about the changes in historiography as well. So maybe this would be a good time to mention those if it's applicable.
Well, speaking of the very beginning of the war, it was initially thought to be a cakewalk. I think there can hardly be any arguments about this, because when the Soviet army moved, they only used the forces of the Leningrad military district. So they did not assemble any big force, and they did not have any significant numerical superiority of the Finns in the first months of the conflict. And which tells you something that's it's entirely possible that the Soviet government expected the Finns to fold within a few days, just after realizing the impossibility of fighting with the entire Soviet Union. So just moving the forces close to the Mannerheim line was thought to be like a persuasive gesture enough to make them sign a peace agreement or agree with concede with all the demands. When initially, naturally the offensive progressed rather successfully for the first few weeks. For the first few days, up to a week. But this was when the Russian troops, when the Soviet troops advanced along the four fields towards the Mannerheim line itself. One of the biggest debacles of the war was in the area of the Taipale River, where the Soviet troops which reached this river did not even have artillery that could be dragged up to them, because the forest roads that they had to advance along were barely good enough to allow one or two peasants' carts to drive by, because they were extremely narrow. And there were enormous traffic jams on these roads, and the artillery lagged far behind. So imagine forcing a river without any artillery support, but that's exactly what they did. And it led to horrendous casualties. The forward troops were kind of followed by a group of Soviet writers and poets and journalists, who were meant to record the victorious pace of the Red Army into Finland, and what they saw was probably not fit for print. The famous poem by Alexander Twardowski, "The River Crossing," it was every Soviet schoolboy read this poem, and it's still very well known in Russia. It was written after witnessing the river crossing at Taipale, that's to the north of Leningrad. When Soviet troops boarded quickly made rafts and rubber boats, and they were mowed down by the hundreds by Finnish machine gun fire. And this was the first place where the first massive reality check. When the Soviet troops approached the Mannerheim line itself, that was about the 7th, 8th, 9th of December. They made some probing attacks. Then they tried several offensives. There was a huge offensive. The Finns called it the Christmas offensive, sometime around the 20th of December, which failed with huge casualties. And it was only after this failed offensive in early January, when the Red Army finally seized these fruitless frontal attacks against very heavily fortified Finnish positions, and they switched to preparing the grounds for preparing the intelligence, preparing the grounds for a massive artillery offensive. But before I get to this, I would like to mention that in the first days, on the 3rd or the 4th of December, the first town that was captured by the Red Army was the town of Terioki, which is Zelenogorsk nowadays. And after capturing the first town of note, because all the other places that the Red Army were captured were just small villages, Stalin decreed that he would only since the liberation of this town, he would only speak to the official and the legitimate government of Finland. And a new Finnish government was created. Its leader was Otto Kuusinen. He used to be a party functionary in the Finnish like Socialist Democratic Party back in 1918, and he was one of the few Red Finns, like top-rated Red Finns, who survived the purges in the late 1930s. A new government was established. It was called the Teriyaki government, and it basically claimed to speak on behalf of the entire Finland. In the end of December, when the massive offensive failed, all news of this government just suddenly ceased. So there was it was never mentioned in the press. Stalin never mentioned it. It just vanished without a trace. Even modern day historians cannot find the exact like papers or decrees or whatever documents that can be related to this government, which is kind of curious. But that's it. So you asked me to tell about the first weeks or the first phase of the war. Here you are.
Thank you.